Chapter 2. Waiting in the night. The encampment was well hidden amidst the rocks and dense trees of the woods of Avondale, with few torches lit to keep their concealment. Hundreds of glowing yellow eyes blinked and swayed in the darkness, the eyes of armed ghouls hungry for the kill. Their enormous gaping mouths were lined with jagged teeth that resembled broken glass, and they pulled and tugged at the raw meat their masters had thrown to them, shredding it to pieces before gulping it down into their putrid bellies. They were vicious beasts of the wilds, usually scavenging in much smaller numbers, but Talgarth had herded them into a swarm of dangerous filth. They did not make for the smartest soldiers, nor was their kind known for their speed or prowess in battle, but they were wicked to the bone and despised humans more than anything else. They knew no emotions but that of hatred toward humans and even other ghouls. Most ghouls stood to the shoulders of the average man, but their broken postures usually bent them much lower. Their grey skin hung from their bones like wet shredded rags, and the nails on their long fingers and giant toes were just as sharp and serrated as their teeth. Whenever a weapon was not handy, these made fine substitutes. The horde of ghouls sat in clusters in the dark, clothed in the robes of Talgarth, dark and crested with a burning blood-red sun. They wore them uneasily and grunted amongst themselves, trying to stave off their hunger for the promised fresh meat of the humans. Not one among them wanted to be there, but somehow they had been forced to. Each time one of the creatures began to get up and sneak away into the night, it would turn and see the large silhouette of the masked man looming at the end of the camp, and fall back onto its rump and cover its head in smoldering fear. Two men walked briskly through the trees, dodging the ghouls and trying to keep even their clothing from brushing them. The man farther behind, Palson Materel, wore an expression of repulsion on his sharp features, his long nose turned as much in the other direction as possible until they reached the looming figure at the edge of camp. The masked man stood over a table and looked down at a blood-stained map illuminated by one small candle in the center that was burning its last hour of wax. The man was tall and broad, as thick as a tree, and wore a dark-colored cloak over heavy armor. The mask on his face encompassed nearly his entire head, and sharp horns twisted out the sides of it. Its shape resembled something like a skull with deep holes for the eyes and a hideous twisted smile of silver teeth, making the whole something that seemed could only be forged in the darkest corner of the earth. The Queen of Talgarth, the lioness herself, was the only one who dared look into the mask as she spoke to him. Next to the man stood a sickly-looking creature, half human, half ghoul. The dark-skinned creature was bulky and strong, but even he looked down at the ground in fear next to the tower of metal that stood beside him. The half-breed looked up in relief as the two approached. As the candlelight began to illuminate them, Palson shifted slightly behind his superior Verfold, whom he followed, just enough to cover the mask of the towering man from his sight. Here he could comfortably listen if he cared to, while Verfold the fool tried to elevate himself. Verfold folded his arms and grimaced at the map. He threw his dark cape back behind his shoulder in protest and whipped his wind-ruffled hair out of his eyes. "Sir, we have just heard from my men near the city. They sense a stir within Tritus. With all due respect, we must move out tonight. If the other garrison from the south has not reached us by now, then something has happened to them. We must take action or all is lost," he stated with a dangerously commanding air. "Quiet, Verfold," the ghoul man snorted through protruding teeth, perspiring anxiously. "You're impatient. If something happened to them, we would know it. If they were found, we'd already be fighting. We need to wait longer. My people will come." His voice was foul and spit fell from his mouth as he struggled to speak without his normal slur. "Your people?" retorted Verfold with a grunt. "You are half man, and yet you consider yourself a ghoul. Perhaps the garrison would have arrived quicker if they were being led by a full man and not a ruined half-breed, Mayor Zuck." Mayor Zuck snarled as inconspicuously as he could, the glare of the masked man fixed upon him like a stone wall. Mayor Zuck gripped the hilt of his scimitar and raked Verfold with his eyes, but Verfold's attention shifted back to the map. Palson had been shifting nervously behind Verfold from the moment tensions rose. He watched with eyes partially hidden by his dark hair that hung around his face and down to his shoulders. He detested Mayor Zuck just as much as Verfold, but had the sense not to show it here. He knew he could kill both Mayor Zuck and Verfold by the sword if he chose, but wondered how well he would fare with this battle of words. Such confrontation was meaningless. The man in the mask stood as still as a statue, his awful metal face grimacing down at them. They never knew what was going on behind the mask, and that was the terror of it. Was he staring at you and plotting your death? Was he asleep and not even listening? Only fate knew. They were ever left to interpret the steady glare of the black, empty eyes and the twisted smile of pointed teeth. Fairfold seemed to recognize how out of line he had been and the danger in it. He coughed and continued, this time with a softer voice but no less aggravated. My lord, the garrison is late, and that can only mean that they have been compromised. If that is the case, patrols from Tritus could be on our trail at this very moment. It is foolish to wait any longer. He looked down at the map, and gestured to the wood pieces scattered across it that represented the other camps lying in wait throughout the dense forests that dotted the kingdom of Avondale. Even without them, we can still take the city. We must attack tonight. Those from within will make up for our loss. Palson's eyes shifted to Mayor Zuck, who was clamping his mouth together tightly, clearly holding back his thoughts, whatever vile things they might be. Suddenly all of them straightened when the masked man spoke. His voice was deep and raspy like the sound of rock grinding against sand. As his words seeped and echoed between the metal teeth, Palson felt a shiver move through his spine. A few of the closer Gruul soldiers shuffled further away from the table. We wait, the man said. The Queen's plans are beyond that of your understanding. Fairfold looked at the ground in artificial humility, but was obviously fuming inside. Yes, Mayor Zuck quickly agreed. Yes, sir, right you are. The Queen knows all. The garrison will come, and then our attack will be perfect. Fairfold sucked in his breath quickly, accepting that his argument could hold no sway. I see, he said slowly, forcing submission, his voice heavy with displeasure. We wait then. But I shall head a small troop around the perimeter, and look for signs of our lost brigade of Gruul muck. He gulped after he heard his last words leave his mouth with a bit too much contempt. He was pushing his luck. He glanced up at the mask once again, as if he would be able to see some sign of his master's annoyance. The hellish face made him turn away. I take my leave, he concluded, nearly knocking Palson over in his rush to depart as quickly as possible. Stop, came the words from behind the mask. Fairfold froze. Palson's heart began to beat faster. There was a 1,000-year silence around the table as all looked on, waiting for the wide shadow to speak. At last his next words came, slow and creaking. What are your thoughts, young captain? The masked man asked, pointing to Palson. Palson's eyes grew wide, and his body tensed as the gaze of the skull slowly turned in his direction and waited menacingly for an answer. He swallowed hard and ran a quick hand through his hair as he wished with all his will that he could shrink and disappear. My lord, he stuttered after a moment of gathering his wits. Of course I stand by your counsel and the counsel of the Queen, sir. And, he trailed off and looked at Fairfold, who was watching him with wide-eyed intensity as if any one of his words would melt the very world they stood on. He didn't care what Fairfold thought, he was a fool. But something about the mask made his valor seep out the bottom of his boots. And well, Palson continued, I think it may be unwise to leave the camp even in search of the garrison. It may prove disastrous to our plan. You have commanded secrecy, sir, and General Fairfold has forgotten this. Several more lifetimes of silence passed by in a few seconds, as the demonic shadow's metal face took in his words and processed them carefully. Everyone flinched when at last the masked man moved from his spot behind the table. Despite his heavy gear and mountain-like demeanor, his movements were swift, his armor creaking atop his joints as he seemed to glide over past Mayor Zuck and Palson. He stopped directly in front of Fairfold. The menacing skull face stared down at him, and Fairfold did not return the look. Palson noticed for the first time as Fairfold stood there helpless the faint sounds of breathing beneath the mask. The mask. He recalled hearing rumors about the mask from some of the men, some kind of terrible secret it held, and he wondered if he was about to behold something he did not want to see. Sir. Fairfold began but stood in silence when the man's hand moved to his side and slowly drew his large sword from its sheath. I see now I have made an error, Fairfold said, pathetically attempting to backtrack in his haughtiness. The sword emerged fully and hung down by the towering man's side, and his deathly gaze of silence endured. Fairfold glanced down at the reflection of the candle fire dancing in the polished blade. Why you would displease the Queen, he stammered. She selected me. I alone can lead our men to victory as you desire. The masked man lifted his arm and dropped a heavy hand on Vifold's shoulder. Palsson thought for a moment it was a reassuring gesture and permission to leave, when suddenly the man's hand grasped Vifold firmly, and his other came up and plunged his sword into Vifold's stomach. Vifold's eyes slowly rose up to meet the cold face before him. You alone can lead them, came the deep resonating voice from beneath the mask. I think not. This is the will of the lioness. Vifold struggled to say something, but the man released his grip, letting his dying body fall into the dirt where he remained motionless. The mask turned to the fear-stricken onlookers. Captain Palsson Materel, your judgment is wiser than his was. You are now General Palsson. Palsson rattled where he stood and nodded with bewilderment. Yes, yes, sir, Lord Marmius. As you wish.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.